Welcome to a new daily top AskReddit video. Today's topic.
What's the craziest WW2 fact that you know of? My all-time favorite WW2 story doesn't involve any violence or killing or destruction at all. Background. Weather patterns in the northern hemisphere generally move west to east. As a result, the Germans were at a disadvantage in not knowing what weather was coming towards Germany because it was coming from the west, i.e., it was coming through areas controlled by the Allies. So, they decided to secretly emplace an unmanned remote weather station on the coast of Canadian Labrador, which could send weather information to Germany by radio. Remember, no such thing as weather satellites back then. The weather station was emplaced by a U-boat in 1943. Since it was kind of hard to hide, although in a very remote area, the Germans put signs on it saying it belonged to the Canadian Weather Service. They also scattered empty packets of US cigarettes around so if anybody found it, they would assume it was an Allied military installation. It was eventually discovered by the Canadians in 1977. In fact, when it was discovered, the local people assumed it was exactly what the Germans had hoped him to think, that it was a Canadian military emplacement. It wasn't until 1981 that someone asked the Canadian military about the old weather station in Labrador, and the Canadian military said, that's not ours. Edit. Sorry, forgot the link. Weather station Kurt. Wikipedia. This is awesome. In France, my uncle Curtis got blown up but still alive. So they morphined him really good and buried him in the sand till the battle moved on. Then they came back and got him. He's still kicking. Here's an article about him. https://www.al.com/live/2012/09/in_we_all-black_tank_battali.html. Holy shit, I've never heard that. But it makes sense. The beaches were hell zones. No cover. Might as well bury him and hope you get back before high tide. Holy shit. I was thinking, bury him and hope you get back before he's been shot or bombed, again. But, high tide, wouldn't that be a new hell, waiting injured in the sand as the water rises up past your ears? Uncle Curtis is a badass, cheers to him. Something tells me Uncle Curtis didn't have a whole lot of say in the matter and probably, hopefully, wasn't conscious. My dad and his brother, Dan, ran into each other randomly in France. They turned around and saw each other, and they both yelled, "What are you doing here?" Quote, I have a couple of photos from that day. They got to spend that day together before going back into hell, and they both survived the war. This is so fucking awesome. Seeing someone you know from home while abroad, in a military, is a wild experience. I can't imagine seeing a brother in between trips through hell. I went to college with a guy who was a ranger and his older brother was a SEAL. I remember him telling a story about securing a rooftop for a little bird to come land on, and one of the guys who got off was his brother. Pretty more likely since it's a smaller theater and they're both special forces but still cool. That time the British dumped a dead man's body with fake plans planted on him so it would wash up in Spain and get turned over to the Germans. Nobody did secret agent stuff like the British. They were absolute masters of deception. The British discovered radar, which was helping them kick ass in the air during night time. And they didn't want anyone to know. So they just told everyone that their pilots were eating carrots. There was a Spanish guy who wanted to be a spy for the UK but they said no. He went to Portugal and convinced the Germans that he could spy for them and pretended to be in London with a whole fake spy network. He gave them fake info based on newspapers and tourist guides, and the Germans kept giving him money to pay his fake people. Whenever the Germans got mad that his info was wrong, he blamed one of his fake spies and had them killed. The British had to choice but to make him one of their agents. He was so good at fooling the Germans. But really, the Nazis were just absolute imbeciles at deception. Operation Mincemeat for anyone that wants to learn more. Unbelievably meticulous. There is even a Netflix movie that stars Colin Firth and Matthew McFadden that is quite good. Trivia. They both previously played the same character, Mr. Darcy, from different versions of Pride and Prejudice. And star together for the first time here. The nuclear attack on Nagasaki almost failed when the bomb plane got separated from their escorts. And they wasted 45 minutes of fuel trying to find them. Should also be noted the original target city was Kokura for the second bomb, but smoke from previous bombing runs, fires and cloud cover, they tried 3 times but could not see their target. With fuel running low, they decided to proceed to backup target of Nagasaki, which also had increased cloud cover, but on the last pass before having to return to base they had a just clear enough window to drop it. It still ended up 2 miles off course, and while still devastating, the natural hills protected a big chunk of the city. The first bomb dropped on Hiroshima was only off by 800 feet and absolutely decimated the city. Air defense over Japan was so weak that a bomber with the world's most valuable bomb could just fly around until it was out of fuel. After Germany invaded France, they forced Citroën to make trucks for them. In an act of sabotage, Citroën moved the full mark on the engine oil dipstick lower. So, the engines would run but fail under heavy use. Brilliant. Similarly, when the guys in Seattle were building me 262 jet replicas, they had some genuine parts to use as patterns. One guy told me he disassembled a nose gear leg to see its inner workings and found a deliberate machining fault that would have, with continued use, eventually worn through and collapsed the oleo. The forced labor machinists doing what little things they could get away with to show defiance. There's a story about an artillery shell landing right inside an Allied position and not exploding. Inside the shell was no explosive, only a note. This was all I could do. Quote, "Oh shit, the engine on my truck blew up. What did you expect, they're French." Quote. During the war, Canada built more military trucks than the major Axis powers. Germany, Japan, Italy, combined. Source. The mighty and technologically unparalleled German army was mostly supplied by horse-drawn wagons. And that was after stealing every car and truck in the occupied countries. Hitler invaded Russia with more horses than Napoleon. Bear with me on this one. In 1942, a company of Polish troops were evacuated from the Soviet Union and found their way to Iran. Along the way, they befriended a Syrian brown bear that they named Wojtek. They officially enlisted him as a private in the unit. The men ended up in Italy from 1943-44, bringing the bear along with them. It helped to carry heavy ammunition and quickly became a celebrity among the troops. Wojtek was eventually discharged after the war and lived peacefully in Edinburgh Zoo until he passed away in 1963. Don't forget that they paid him in cigarettes. And his army buddies would come visit him at the zoo. As much as I love the mental image of a bear smoking a cigarette, I think he just ate them. A member of the U.S. Navy survived being stabbed 4 times by Japanese bayonets during the Bataan Death March when he was a POW in the Philippines. He buried a spoon in the ground before the march started that he promised he'd come back and retrieve when the war was over to prove he survived. In 1946, he returned to the Philippines and dug up the spoon to bring home. That man was my great-uncle. And my family still has that spoon 82 years later. Not the most crazy World War II fact. But it's one that's personal to my family. That's awesome. My family has a metal chalice from my great-uncle at Normandy. He picked it up after the fight was over. He scratched his name, date, and location on it, and brought it back with him. He never married and it passed to my dad. German and American soldiers fought alongside French prisoners against the SS during the last days of the war. The Battle of Castle Itter. Edit. If I had a nickel for every time the Wehrmacht and the Americans teamed up against the SS during WW2, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. After the annexation of Austria to Nazi Germany in 1938, the Lipizzaner breeding mares of the Spanish riding school in Vienna were transferred to an experimental farm in the town of Hostau, in Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia. The goal was to create a race of Aryan horses. The first sentence of Operation Cowboy sounds like a random word generator. How is this not already a movie featuring Matthew McConaughey and Christoph Waltz? It's currently in pre-production. https://m.imdb.com/title/tt513822/. Hugh Laurie to play a German who is later revealed to be an American. Who right at the end is revealed to be French. When you said German soldiers, I was just thinking you meant German nationals fighting for the Allies. But no. It was the German army, not part of the SS. Being like, okay Nazis. The war is actually over. Knock this shit out. Not only that, a former PM, and a tennis star. It's super weird. The atomic bomb was the second most expensive project of World War II. The most expensive project of World War II was the B-29 bomber, used to drop the atomic bomb. And the Soviets stole it. 3 B-29s landed at Vladivostok after bombing Japan. The USSR, being neutral in the Pacific War, impounded them and detained the crews, before quietly slipping them to the Americans on the Lend-Lease route. In a top-secret program, Stalin told the aircraft designer Tupolev, who had just been released from a gulag, to reverse-engineer the planes under the supervision of the NKVD. Beria, world-renowned cunt, said that if anything was altered or compromised from the original design, the design teams would be shot. The American planes were made to imperial measurements and the Soviets only had access to manufacturing in metric, so the metals were slightly different thicknesses to cover this, and it seemed like they were absolutely identical. The design team included battle damage and matched the internal color scheme by inventing a new type of paint in the right color. It worked, and the Tupolev 4, the USSR's first intercontinental bomber, was unveiled at the May Day March of 1947 when 424s flew over, thus proving they weren't the detained B-29s. One beam in the wing had an extra hole drilled in error. The Soviets faithfully reproduced this hole in every Soviet copy. I just learned this yesterday while watching a Netflix series on WW2. Something like a tenth of the Russian population died. More like a seventh. And it was not uniformly distributed. It is estimated that around 80% of Soviet males born in 1923 did not survive World War II. Quote, even worse in Poland, 21% of the entire population died. The Purple Heart medals that the United States awards to its wounded soldiers today were minted in preparation for the anticipated massive casualties that would result from a land invasion of Japan. ATA. Apparently I'm wrong and the last of those World War II era medals were handed out in 2000 or 2010 or thereabouts. Thanks to several commenters for the correction. ATA 2, per you, Andy 802, maybe I was right the first time. That is insane to me. They were expecting so many to die that we're still using them today. Pretty sobering thought. Pretty much any estimate I've heard of the death toll says that more Japanese would have died in a land invasion than those killed by the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.